Chapter 15. A Rewarding Hunt. Henri Fontaine was excited and concerned about the portrait of his sister that had been tampered with. "It spoils the whole outline of the ruffle, and look what it does to the toe of the slipper," he said. "A botch." "Only an expert would know that," George stated. "I think it's a lovely painting." "It's beautiful," Bess spoke up. "And it looks so real, Ellen, just like you." But the cousin's remarks failed to mollify the Fontaines. "Some enemy of ours ruined this painting," said Henri angrily. "But why? Why?" "Perhaps the paint was used to cover something that was smuggled into the country," Nancy said. "A message, an important chemical formula, or even jewels." Bess looked skeptical. How could jewels be hidden in paint? Before Nancy could answer, Henri cried excitedly, "Of course they could! I'll show you." His eyes roved over the outfit each of the three girls was wearing. Finally, his glance settled on a pin of rhinestones which Bess wore on her blouse. "May I use this for an experiment?" he asked. "I'll be glad to pay for it." "That's not necessary," said Bess, handing him the pin. "It's just a piece of inexpensive costume jewelry." Immediately, the young artist started prying loose the settings and took out several of the stones. They were of various sizes, the largest equal to a 2-carat diamond. Henri got a tube of green pigment and squeezed some of it onto a palette. Then he slowly rolled one of the rhinestones around in the paint. When it was completely covered, the artist secreted the mass among the leaves of one of the trees on the canvas. It melted into the background as if it had always been there. "Why, that's wonderful," Bess said. Next, Henri embedded several rhinestones into the dancer's frilly tutu. Finally, the young man concealed a stone in the toe of one of the scarlet slippers. "Remarkable," said Hélène. "No one would detect this strange addition to my portrait. Nancy, what does this mean?" "It's my hunch that a smuggler brought jewels into the United States this way. It is more clever than hiding them in the frame because that would show up in an X-ray, while this method wouldn't. It looks as though Henri's paintings were ordered for the purpose of smuggling. You used the impasto technique, Henri, and that's just what was needed for hiding the jewels." Henri examined every speck of the old pigment for anything which might still be in it, but found nothing. "Have you any idea about the identity of the smuggler?" Hélène asked Nancy. "Yes," the girl detective answered. "It would explain why Mr. Judson, who isn't an artist, carries a palette knife. As I told my father, I strongly suspect he's Raoul Amiens. What I don't know is how Amiens got the painting from René, and whether René is involved in the smuggling." "If the police want René," said George, "he probably is involved." "Well, where does the trail take us now?" To everyone's complete astonishment, Nancy laughed and said, "Into the lake. I'm so warm I can't resist a swim. Anybody want to join me?" "In these clothes?" Bess exclaimed. Nancy announced that during the summer she always carried swim togs in the trunk of the convertible, and right now she had 2 suits with her. Hélène had an extra one, so the whole group spent an enjoyable half-hour swimming in Cedar Lake. Later, when Nancy was driving home with Bess and George, she remarked, "Maybe all 12 paintings were used by smugglers. Since the one with the scarlet slippers was sold to a dancing school in this part of the country, some of the others might have been too. Let's check." The girls decided to meet at the Drew home in the morning and take turns telephoning to ballet dancing schools in the state. By the time the cousins arrived, Nancy had a list of 50. They divided the work and began telephoning. They had gone about halfway through the names when suddenly George, who was at the telephone, smiled broadly and bobbed her head at the other girls. Into the mouthpiece, she said, "Thank you very much. We'll be over to look at it." She replaced the telephone, then said to Nancy and Bess, "One of the pictures is in Harwick. It was sold to the dance studio by a red-haired man." "Oh, that's marvelous," said Nancy. "But Harwick," Bess exclaimed. "That's almost 200 miles from River Heights." "What's 200 miles?" Nancy asked. "We'll pack overnight bags and make a real trip out of it. That is, if we can leave our own school that long." Bess offered to forego the trip and take Nancy's class that afternoon, but the others insisted that she go with them. Finally, she arranged with a dancing instructor at a private school in town to take the classes. Late in the morning, the girls started out. They had the top down, took turns at the wheel, and enjoyed the bright blue sky and delightful farmland country along the way. But Nancy did not completely forget the errand on which they had embarked. "I've been thinking a lot about the stolen ballet slippers that belonged to Ellen's mother," she remarked. "There must be some special significance to them." "Maybe something was hidden in them, too," Bess suggested. "Possibly. But it's strange that neither Ellen nor Henri knew about it." The girls reached Harwick late in the afternoon and drove immediately to the attractive building which housed the Harwick School of the Dance. As Nancy and her friends walked into the reception room, they saw Ellen's portrait in a prominent position on the wall. "How lovely!" Bess murmured. The painting portrayed the girl in a graceful glissade. It was so realistic, Ellen looked as though she were about to glide right off the canvas. An attractive blonde woman in ballet costume came forward and introduced herself as Miss Desmond, the director of the school. George identified herself as the one who had talked with her on the telephone that morning and presented Nancy and Bess. Then she added, "Nancy is an amateur detective. She's investigating a case we think involves the smuggling of precious stones. We believe that they were hidden in the pigment of certain pictures. Yours may be one of them." "Oh dear!" Miss Desmond exclaimed. "I hope this won't involve me. I know nothing about the smuggled gems." "I didn't mean to imply that," said George. She regretted having been so blunt. "This must be somewhat of a shock to you," Nancy said understandingly. "But would you mind if we examine the picture closely?" Her quick eye had detected a spot where the pigment had been tampered with. "Go ahead," Miss Desmond said. Nancy took a small magnifying glass from her handbag and scrutinized the painting. "Something has been removed from the picture, I'm sure," she said after a moment. "And," Nancy added, her voice excited, "if I'm not mistaken, there is still one stone hidden." "What?" Miss Desmond exclaimed unbelievingly. Nancy pointed to the spot and asked, "Will you let me prove it?" "Why, certainly, but you don't think the worried director began. Nancy smiled at the woman. "We believe you bought the picture without knowing all this." Miss Desmond looked relieved and watched as Nancy took the palette knife with the R initial on it from her bag and began to scrape the white pigment in one ruffle of the skirt. Finally, a large lump came off in her hand. She scraped at it even faster. A moment later, she uncovered a sparkling diamond. "I just can't believe it," Miss Desmond cried, as Bess and George gasped. I certainly got my money's worth, didn't I?" Then instantly an expression of alarm crossed her face. "But I may be holding stolen property. What shall I do with the stone?" "I'd suggest," said Nancy, "that you go with me to the Harwick police station and leave the diamond there until the case is cleared up." The dancing school director said the sooner she got rid of the diamond, and the painting too, the better. Miss Desmond was glad to sell the painting to Nancy for $10. She accompanied Nancy to the police station while the cousins remained at the school to admit the next class of pupils. The director sighed when the ordeal was over. "Thank you, Nancy, for getting me out of an embarrassing situation," she said. "And good luck in solving the mystery." The girls spent the night in a hotel in Harwick. They started on their return journey early the next morning, with the painting stored in the trunk. As they drove along, all three girls on the front seat, they discussed the various facets of the case. Presently, Nancy said, "I have a strange feeling that those little figurines that were sold to Mr. Howard, the jeweler, were used for smuggling jewels into this country, maybe by the same group. And Mr. Wart removed them and tried to patch up the crack," Bess suggested. "Yes." Hours later, as Nancy took a road leading away from River Heights, George called Nancy's attention to the wrong turn. "I know," said Nancy. "I thought we'd stop to see Ellen and Henri and leave this picture." Presently, they turned into the woods road leading to the Nickerson cabin. Nancy had to drive slowly because of the twists and turns on the winding trail. Rounding a sharp curve, Nancy almost ran into a barrier across the road. A bridge over a stream was down, and sawhorses had been set up to warn motorists. As Nancy jammed on the brake, George said in disgust, "Well, of all things! Why didn't they put up a sign where we entered this road?" "What'll we do, Nancy?" Bess asked. "Walk the rest of the way?" "I suppose so," Nancy said. She had her hand on the door handle to turn it when a voice back of the girls called in a heavy French accent, "Do not turn around! You are my prisoners, and will do exactly what I tell you!" End of chapter 15.